The wind cut through the crowded market street like icy blades, making Kayla pull her little girl closer to her chest. Leary's small hands clung to her mother's neck, her body shivering under the thin fabric. The night lights of the stalls flickered weakly, casting shadows on Kayla's tired face. She had been walking since morning, stopping at every shop, every vendor, asking for work or help, but each time the answer was the same. A quick shake of the head or eyes looking away, as if she didn't exist. Her stomach was empty, but her daughter's hollow eyes told her she didn't have the right to think about her own hunger. The coat she once had was gone. The boots were gone. All that remained was the simple, warm dress she wore, the last decent thing she owned. It wasn't just clothing. It was her shield against the cold and her dignity in a world that had taken everything else. But Leary's small lips were pale now, and she kept licking them as if trying to remember the taste of food. Kayla stopped in front of a merchant's stall, the glow from the heat lamp making her eyes sting. She looked at the man, her voice soft but steady. "How much for this dress?" The merchant, a thick-bodied alien with sharp ridges along his skull, raised an eyebrow. His gaze traveled slowly over the fabric, then over her bare feet. "It's worn," he said lazily, but his eyes betrayed interest. "It's warm," Kayla replied, holding Leary tighter so the man wouldn't see her shiver. "Enough to get you through nights like this." He named a price that was far less than it was worth, but she didn't argue. Every second she stood there, Leary's small body trembled more. Kayla nodded. Without another word, she stepped behind a curtain in the back of the stall. She removed the dress, the fabric brushing her skin one last time, and handed it over. The merchant gave her a small bag in return, dry bread, a handful of dried fruit, and a flask of lukewarm broth. She slipped on the rough, itchy sack the merchant tossed her way as if he were throwing scraps to a stray animal. The fabric scratched her skin, but she ignored it. The food was heavy in her hands, and Leary's tired eyes lit up at the sight of it. Kayla guided her to a dark alley between two closed shops, far from the noise and light of the market. They sat on the cold stone ground, knees pressed together. Kayla opened the bag, tearing the bread into small pieces so Leary could eat slowly. The girl's tiny fingers clutched the bread like treasure, biting carefully, savoring each mouthful. Kayla took a sip of the broth, enough to quiet the worst of her hunger, and gave the rest to Leary. She tried to smile, but her eyes stayed on the narrow alley opening, alert for trouble. The sound of laughter drifted from the market, but it was not warm or kind. Heavy footsteps crunched on the frost-covered stones. Shadows shifted at the mouth of the alley, and 3 alien men stepped inside. Their eyes locked on Kayla and Leary, lingering too long. "Well, well," the tallest one said, a grin stretching across his jagged teeth. "A widow and her pup. Looks like someone found food tonight." Kayla instinctively pulled the bag closer and shielded her daughter with her arm. She didn't speak, hoping they would pass, but the men stepped closer. "Not fair, keeping it all for yourselves," another one said, his hand reaching toward the sack. Her heart pounded. She knew she couldn't fight them, not with Leary in her arms. Her mind raced for an escape, but the alley was blocked by their broad bodies. Before the man's hand could reach the food, a new sound filled the alley. Slow, heavy, deliberate footsteps, not the uneven shuffle of drunks or the hurried stride of merchants. These steps were measured, steady, carrying a weight of confidence. The kind of steps that made people look up without knowing why. From the darkness at the far end of the alley, a tall figure emerged. His boots were thick, leaving deep prints in the frost. A long coat swayed with his movements, and the dim market light caught the faint gleam of metal strapped to his belt. His face was shadowed, but when he spoke, his voice was low and even. "Leave them." The 3 aliens turned, their grins fading slightly. "Who are you to tell us what to do, human?" the tallest sneered, spitting the last word like an insult. Kayla's breath caught. She had heard of humans in this part of the city, soldiers, mercenaries, troublemakers. She didn't trust them, but right now, she didn't know if this one was danger or salvation. The human stepped forward, closing the space between himself and the thugs. The air in the alley shifted, as if the cold had thickened. He didn't raise his voice, but each word carried weight. "I said, leave them." One of the aliens laughed, though it sounded forced. "And if we don't?" The human's hand rested on the weapon at his belt, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then you'll regret it. Kayla's heart was in her throat. She tightened her hold on Leary, ready to move if violence erupted. The food bag felt heavy in her lap, the last thing she had, the last thing keeping her daughter from starving tonight. The air seemed to freeze in place as the aliens glanced at each other, measuring their odds. Then the tallest one stepped back with a grunt. "Not worth it," he muttered. Without another word, they turned and disappeared into the market's noise. Kayla's breath came out in a shaky rush. She looked at the human, unsure whether to thank him or run. His gaze swept over her sackcloth clothing, the bruises on her arms, and the way she held her daughter like she might vanish. He didn't smile or ask questions. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his voice calm but certain. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. She stayed silent, her mistrust thick as the winter air, but her eyes searched his face for any sign of cruelty. From behind him, the sound of distant boots echoed again, but these were faster, sharper, searching for someone. The human glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "You need to move. Now." Her fingers tightened on Leary, and before she could speak, he turned slightly, revealing the faint mark of a soldier's badge on his coat. And for the first time that night, Kayla felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost. Hope. Daniel's eyes stayed on Kayla and Leary as if he was making a quick judgment about them. His hand rested loosely near the weapon on his belt, but he didn't move toward it. Kayla shifted slightly, keeping her daughter behind her, though Leary peeked out at him with wide, curious eyes. She didn't trust humans. She had heard too many stories. Humans were fighters, dangerous, unpredictable. Some said they helped, others said they destroyed everything they touched. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "You're not safe here. This alley isn't a place for a child." Kayla didn't answer. Her first instinct was to protect the food in her lap. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to lose it to a stranger. She pulled the sack closer, her knuckles white. "We're fine," she said quietly, even though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Daniel noticed. He also noticed the way she was trying to hide the bread and fruit from him. Instead of reaching for it, he crouched down to Leary's level. "Is she your daughter?" he asked softly. Kayla stiffened. "Don't talk to her." He raised his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you, but those men will come back. They'll bring more friends next time." Before Kayla could reply, a sound echoed from the far end of the alley, low laughter and the shuffle of boots. The same 3 thugs had returned, this time with 2 more. The leader's grin was wider now, his jagged teeth catching the light. "Look who's still here," he said, "and our new friend is still guarding them." Daniel didn't rise from his crouch. His eyes flicked to Kayla. "Stay behind me." The thugs spread out, trying to box him in. One of them pulled a curved blade from his belt, the metal glinting in the dim light. Another cracked his knuckles, eager for a fight. "You think you can scare us?" the tallest sneered. Daniel finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm not trying to scare you." He stepped forward, closing the distance. "I'm trying to give you one chance to walk away." The thug with the blade lunged first, fast but sloppy. Daniel sidestepped, grabbing the attacker's arm and twisting it sharply. The blade clattered to the ground, and a sharp cry of pain filled the alley. Without hesitation, Daniel kicked the weapon away and shoved the thug backward into the wall. The others moved in at once. Daniel blocked a punch with his forearm and countered with a hard strike to the alien's ribs. Another swung at him from behind, but Daniel ducked low, sweeping the attacker's legs. The fight was quick, brutal, and efficient. Kayla held Leary close, her heart pounding. She had never seen anyone move like that. Every motion was calculated, precise, almost cold. The thugs had numbers, but Daniel had skill. One of the aliens managed to land a blow, his fist connecting with Daniel's side. Daniel grunted, but didn't slow. He drove his elbow into the attacker's face, sending him stumbling backward with a broken snarl. Finally, the leader realized they were losing. He spat on the ground and barked at the others. "Let's go. Not worth dying over." They retreated, limping and cursing, disappearing into the market's noise again. Daniel stood still for a moment, his breath steady despite the fight. Then Kayla noticed it, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his coat. His right arm was bleeding, the fabric torn where a blade had grazed him. "You're hurt," she said before she could stop herself. "It's fine," he replied, glancing at the wound. His focus immediately shifted back to her daughter. Is she hurt? Kayla shook her head. No. Daniel nodded once, as if that was all that mattered. Then we need to move. They won't give up. And if they saw her face, others might come looking. Kayla frowned. Why would anyone care about us? We have nothing. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if he was reading something in her eyes. Nothing worth money to you doesn't mean nothing worth money to them. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. His words made sense, but she didn't want to think about what they meant. Leary tugged at Kayla's sackcloth sleeve. Mama, I'm cold. Daniel's gaze softened slightly. There's a place you can stay for the night. It's not much, but it's safe. Kayla hesitated. Trusting him could be a mistake, but the image of those thugs returning with more men was fresh in her mind. Her daughter's small hands were icy against her skin. She knew the street would not be kind to them tonight. I can't pay you, she said carefully. I didn't ask for payment, Daniel replied. I'm asking you to live to see tomorrow. The words hung in the air. Kayla's heart was torn between caution and desperation. Finally, she gave a small nod. Daniel stepped aside, letting her move ahead of him. He kept a careful distance, his eyes scanning every shadow as they walked toward the edge of the market. The noise of the stalls faded behind them, replaced by the soft crunch of frost underfoot. Leary's head rested against Kayla's shoulder, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. Kayla kept glancing back at Daniel. He didn't look at her, only at the streets, the rooftops, the corners, anywhere danger could hide. They turned down a narrow side street, passing a row of boarded-up shops. The wind bit through Kayla's thin covering, but Daniel's steady pace didn't slow. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. Finally, they reached a rusted metal door at the base of an old storage building. Daniel knocked twice, then entered without waiting for an answer. The air inside was warmer, smelling faintly of oil and dust. It wasn't much, just a few crates, an old table, and a pile of blankets in one corner. But to Kayla, it looked like a palace compared to the cold street. Daniel gestured to the blankets. She can sleep there. There's food on the table. Rest. I'll keep watch. Kayla hesitated again, torn between mistrust and gratitude. But when she set Leary down on the blankets and saw her daughter curl up with a small smile, her decision was made for her. Daniel moved to the door, his back to them. Kayla sat beside Leary, watching him. She didn't know if she could trust him yet, but for the first time in weeks, she felt the smallest thread of safety. Outside, the frost-covered street was silent, but in the distance, faint voices carried through the night, searching, calling, asking questions. Someone was looking for the widow and the child. The sound outside grew louder, the voices clearer now. Kayla sat frozen beside her daughter, her heart beating so hard she thought it might give her away. Leary stirred under the blanket, but didn't wake. Daniel glanced over his shoulder at Kayla, his eyes sharp, and held a finger to his lips. She nodded slowly, her hands instinctively wrapping around her child. Daniel moved to the small, dirty window and looked out through a gap in the boards. A dim light passed by in the street, followed by the shadows of two figures. They were scanning the buildings, stopping at doors, peering into dark corners. Kayla couldn't make out their faces, but something in their slow, deliberate movements made her uneasy. They're searching, Daniel murmured without turning away from the window. Kayla's throat felt dry. For who? She whispered, though part of her feared the answer. Daniel's eyes flicked to her for a brief second. You know? She looked down at Leary's sleeping face. The girl's lips were no longer pale from hunger, but her cheeks were still cold to the touch. The thought of those men taking her daughter made Kayla's stomach twist. Daniel stepped back from the window and moved to the door. He locked it quietly, then dragged a crate in front of it. We'll wait until they're gone. The minutes stretched painfully long. The voices outside faded, but Kayla didn't relax. She didn't believe in easy luck. She had lived too long on the streets to trust silence. It often meant worse things were coming. Finally, Daniel stepped away from the door. They're moving on, he said. He walked to a corner where a metal container sat on a crate. Opening it, he revealed a few ration packs and 2 bottles of water. He placed them on the table and pushed one toward her. Eat. You need strength. Kayla shook her head. It's yours. I'm not the one starving, he replied. His voice was calm, but there was no softness in it. He was stating a fact, not offering kindness. She hesitated, then reached for the pack. Inside was something like dried meat and bread. She broke it into pieces, giving most of it to Leary. The child ate sleepily, too tired to question where it had come from. Kayla watched Daniel as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the door. "Why are you helping us?" she asked finally. He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted briefly to her and then back to the shadows on the floor. "I've seen enough people look away. I'm not one of them." His words didn't tell her much, but they carried a weight she couldn't ignore. A cold draft slid through the gaps in the wall, making her pull the blanket tighter around Leary. She thought of the market, the thugs, the price she had paid just to give her daughter one meal. Now here she was in a stranger's shelter, wondering if she had traded one danger for another. Daniel must have sensed her unease. "I'm not keeping you here," he said. "When morning comes, you can leave. But if you stay out there tonight, they'll find you." Kayla didn't answer. She focused on Leary, brushing the girl's hair back from her face. Hours passed. The only sounds were the faint hum of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old building. Kayla's eyes grew heavy, but she didn't want to sleep. She didn't want to let her guard down. At some point, she must have drifted off because she woke to Daniel's low voice. "Get up." Her head snapped up, heart racing. Leary stirred again, but didn't wake fully. "What is it?" she whispered. "They're back," he said. His voice was calm, but his posture was tense. He moved to the window again, peering out. "And they're not alone this time." Kayla's chest tightened. "Why us?" Daniel stepped away from the window, checking the weapon on his belt. "That's what I'd like to know." Footsteps approached the building. The crunch of frost under boots was slow, deliberate. Someone knocked on the door, not loud, but with a strange, steady rhythm, like they already knew who was inside. Kayla's hands gripped the blanket around her daughter, her breath caught in her throat. Daniel didn't move toward the door. Instead, he scanned the room, looking for other exits. "There's a back way," he said, pointing to a narrow door half hidden behind some crates. She moved toward it quickly, lifting Leary into her arms. Daniel followed, keeping low and silent. He eased the back door open just enough to look outside. The alley behind the building was empty, though the faint sound of voices drifted from the street. "Go," he whispered. Kayla hesitated. "And you?" "I'll be right behind you." She stepped out into the cold air, the frost crunching under her bare feet. The alley was narrow, the walls damp and cracked. Daniel closed the door quietly and took the lead, guiding them along the narrow path. They moved quickly, every shadow feeling like a threat. Kayla kept glancing back, certain that any second the men from the market would appear. They reached another street, quieter than the market, but no less dangerous. Daniel scanned the area before signaling her to follow. They ducked into another alley, then another, until Kayla lost all sense of direction. Finally, they stopped behind a crumbling brick wall. Daniel crouched, listening. Kayla could hear the distant shouts of men calling out descriptions, hers and Leary's. "They're looking for you," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "And they're not going to stop." She swallowed hard. "I don't understand. I have nothing they want." Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes now, curiosity mixed with suspicion. "Maybe you don't think you do." She didn't like the way he said it, but she couldn't argue. She didn't even know why she was still alive after the day she'd had. They stayed in the shadows until the voices faded again. Daniel finally stood. "We'll go back to the shelter, but tomorrow you tell me everything. If I'm going to keep you alive, I need to know what I'm protecting you from." Kayla nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure she could trust him with the truth. But the way he had moved through the streets, the way he had shielded them from danger, it was hard to ignore. When they returned to the shelter, Leary was already asleep in her mother's arms. Kayla laid her down gently, then sat against the wall. Daniel remained at the door, watching the street through the cracks, his posture never relaxing. Kayla closed her eyes, but her mind was still racing. She didn't know who those men were or why they wanted her, but she knew one thing: the human was right. They weren't going to stop. Kayla woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. Her eyes flew open, and her first thought was for Leary. The little girl was still asleep, curled up under the blanket, her breathing soft. Daniel was already awake, crouched by the window, his hand resting on his weapon. He looked back at Kayla and gave a small shake of his head, a silent warning to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped near the front door. A shadow passed over the cracks in the wood, blocking out the faint light from the street. Then came a slow, heavy knock, 3 firm hits that made the thin walls vibrate. Kayla's chest tightened. She didn't need to see their faces to know it wasn't friendly. Daniel motioned for her to move. He pointed to the back door, the same one they had used the night before. Kayla grabbed Leary, careful not to wake her fully, and followed him. This time, Daniel didn't step outside immediately. He leaned against the door, listening. A faint mechanical sound filled the air, almost like a scanner sweeping over the walls. Kayla froze. She knew that sound. Only bounty hunters used those kinds of devices. The realization hit her hard. They weren't just random thugs looking for food to steal. These men were hunting her. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he glanced at her. "You know them." It wasn't a question. Kayla hesitated, then shook her head quickly. "I've seen their kind before." Outside, a voice called out, deep and rough. "We know you're in there, widow. Come out, and the child stays safe." Kayla's blood ran cold. Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. He didn't wait for her to answer. He pushed a crate in front of the back door and moved silently toward the front. Kayla followed, her heart pounding. The front door creaked under another knock, louder this time. Daniel pressed himself to the side of it, signaling Kayla to stay hidden in the shadows. Slowly, the latch began to rattle. Whoever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. In one sudden movement, Daniel yanked the door open. The first bounty hunter barely had time to react before Daniel slammed his shoulder into him, sending him stumbling back into the street. The second one raised a weapon, but Daniel twisted it from his hands and threw him into the wall. The fight was fast and vicious. Kayla crouched low, holding Leary, her breath shallow. She could hear the grunts of effort, the dull thuds of fists hitting flesh, the sharp crack of bone. One of the hunters managed to slash Daniel's arm with a short blade, but he didn't slow. He disarmed the man and knocked him out cold with a single blow. The third bounty hunter tried to retreat, pulling a communicator from his belt, but Daniel caught him by the collar and slammed him into the wall. "Who sent you?" His voice was low but dangerous. The alien's eyes darted toward Kayla, then back to Daniel. "Ask her." Daniel's gaze shifted to her instantly, sharp and questioning. Kayla felt her breath catch. She had hoped to keep the truth buried, but the way Daniel was looking at her told her that wasn't possible anymore. "They won't stop," the bounty hunter spat. "Not until they get what she has." Daniel shoved the man to the ground and pressed a knee into his chest. "What is it?" he demanded. Kayla hesitated, her voice trembling. "It's nothing. Just old things from my husband." The bounty hunter gave a harsh laugh. "Old things? You mean the chip? The one with the coordinates?" Daniel's eyes narrowed even further. "Coordinates to what?" Kayla didn't answer, but the flicker in her expression gave her away. The bounty hunter grinned, his teeth sharp. "To the rebel armory. Enough weapons to restart the war." Daniel froze for a moment, absorbing the information. Then, without a word, he slammed the hunter's head against the ground, knocking him unconscious. Kayla clutched Leary tighter. Her husband's voice echoed in her memory, the night before he died, pressing the small metal chip into her hand, telling her to keep it safe, telling her never to let it fall into the wrong hands. She had hidden it ever since, never speaking of it to anyone. She thought no one knew. She had been wrong. Daniel stood, wiping blood from his arm. "You should have told me," he said, his tone hard but not cruel. "I couldn't," she whispered. "If anyone knew, they already know," he cut in. He moved quickly, grabbing supplies from the table and shoving them into a small pack. "We can't stay here. More will come, and they'll be better prepared." Kayla's mind raced. "Where will we go?" Daniel glanced at her, his eyes steady. "Somewhere they can't track you, but you have to trust me now." She looked down at Leary, who was watching Daniel with wide, tired eyes. Trusting him could lead them into more danger, but staying would mean certain capture. Outside, distant voices rose again, growing louder. Kayla's decision was made for her. She gave a small nod. Daniel opened the back door, scanning the alley. The frost crunched under their feet as they moved quickly into the shadows. Kayla could hear the hunters behind them, searching, calling out. They slipped into the maze of back streets. Daniel always a step ahead, guiding them through the cold night. Kayla's arms ached from holding Leary, but she didn't dare slow down. After several turns, Daniel led them into a narrow passage barely wide enough for one person at a time. The walls were damp, the ground uneven. At the far end was a heavy door, rusted and nearly hidden behind stacked crates. Daniel shoved the crates aside and pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dark room lit only by a single lamp. It smelled faintly of oil and old metal. Daniel closed the door behind them and locked it. "We'll rest here for a while," he said. "Then we move again." Kayla sat on the floor with Leary, her back against the wall. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and felt the shape of the small metal chip still hidden. It was cold against her skin, a reminder of the danger it carried. Daniel sat across from her, watching her closely. "When you're ready," he said, "tell me everything. Because now I'm in this whether I want to be or not." Kayla looked into his eyes, seeing no mockery or greed, only a quiet resolve. For the first time since her husband's death, she considered the possibility that she might not be alone in this fight. Kayla sat in the corner of the dim room, her arms wrapped tightly around Leary. The little girl had fallen asleep, her small hand still clutching a piece of bread from earlier. Daniel sat across from them, leaning against the wall with his coat off. He had torn a strip from it to bandage his bleeding arm, but the wound still looked fresh. His eyes stayed on her, calm but sharp, waiting for her to speak. She took a deep breath, her voice low. "My husband. He wasn't just a traitor. He was part of the resistance. The night before he died, he came home in the middle of the night. His clothes were torn, and there was blood on his hands. He told me to take something and hide it. He said it could change everything if it fell into the right hands, or destroy everything if it didn't." Her hand trembled as she reached into the folds of her rough sackcloth and pulled out a small, flat piece of metal no bigger than a coin. The surface was scratched, but a faint light pulsed in its center. "This is what they want." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What's on it?" Kayla hesitated, then whispered, "Coordinates to a hidden rebel armory. My husband said it had weapons, supplies, and data, enough to restart the war." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's why the bounty hunters won't stop. Whoever controls that armory will control the fight." Kayla nodded. "I never told anyone. I thought, if I kept moving, no one would know I had it. But they found me. And now?" She looked at Leary, her eyes filled with fear. "They'll never stop chasing us." Daniel didn't speak for a moment. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, "You can't keep running forever. You either destroy it or deliver it to someone who can protect it." Kayla's voice rose slightly. "Destroy it? My husband died to protect this." "I'm not saying it's worthless," Daniel replied evenly. "I'm saying you need to survive to make sure it's used right. Dead, it won't matter who has it." Kayla looked away, anger and fear twisting inside her. She had been alone for so long, every decision hers alone to make. Now here was this human, telling her what to do as if he had the right. But deep down, she knew he was right about one thing. They couldn't stay here. Leary stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly, and Kayla gently stroked her hair. "Even if we give it to the rebels," she said quietly, "how do we get to them? They're scattered, hidden, and the roads are full of hunters." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I know a way, but it won't be easy." Before Kayla could ask what he meant, a faint red light flashed through a crack in the wall. Daniel's head snapped toward it, his hand going to his weapon. Kayla froze. He moved to the window and peered out. In the distance, faint beams of light swept across the street. Search drones. They moved slowly, methodically, scanning buildings one by one. "They're close," Daniel said in a low voice. "We need to move now." Kayla stood quickly, lifting Leary into her arms. The girl stirred but didn't fully wake. Daniel grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder. "Follow me, stay low, and don't make a sound." They slipped out the back door into the freezing night. The alley was darker here, the buildings leaning over them like silent watchers. Frost crunched under their feet, and Kayla winced at every sound. Daniel led them through a maze of narrow passages, avoiding the main streets where the drone lights passed overhead. Once, they had to duck into the shadows as a patrol of armed bounty hunters marched by, their boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. Kayla could feel her heartbeat in her throat until they were gone. After what felt like hours, Daniel stopped in front of a broken section of wall. He pushed aside loose bricks, revealing a small opening just big enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side was an old drainage tunnel, the smell of damp stone and rust heavy in the air. "This will take us under the main road," Daniel whispered. "We'll come out near the freight station. If we can get on a transport, we might have a chance." Kayla's arms ached from carrying Leary, but she didn't complain. She followed Daniel through the tunnel, the sound of dripping water echoing around them. Every so often, he would stop and listen, his head tilted as if he could hear danger before it came. Halfway through, Kayla spoke in a low voice. "Why are you helping us?" "Really?" Daniel didn't look back. "Because I've seen what happens when people like you get left behind, and because I don't like being told who should live and who should die." There was no pride in his tone, no need for thanks. It was just the truth. They reached the other end of the tunnel, where a rusted grate blocked the exit. Daniel pushed it open with a soft creak and peeked outside. The freight station loomed in the distance, its lights dim compared to the bright streets they had left behind. But between them and the station were three figures, armed, alert, scanning the area. Daniel pulled back, his brow furrowed. "They're waiting." Kayla's stomach sank. "For us?" "Probably," he said, "but they don't know we're behind them." He studied the ground, the walls, the shadows, then turned to her. "I'll distract them. When I move, you run straight for the far side of the station. There's a cargo lift. Hide there until I get to you." Her eyes widened. "What if you don't?" "I will," he said simply. Before she could protest, he was gone, moving like a shadow toward the figures. Kayla crouched low, clutching Leary, her heart pounding. A moment later, she heard a sharp crash, metal hitting stone, followed by shouts. The guards turned toward the noise, weapons raised. Kayla ran. Her bare feet were numb from the cold, but she didn't stop. Leary's arms clung to her neck as they darted between crates and machinery. She reached the lift and ducked inside, pressing herself against the wall, her breath ragged. She listened for Daniel, every second stretching endlessly. Then, just as fear began to grip her, a shadow slipped into the lift beside her. Daniel was breathing hard, a cut on his cheek, but he was alive. "They're not far behind," he said. "We have to keep moving." As the lift rattled upward, Kayla felt the weight of the chip in her pocket. Every danger they faced was because of it, and yet it was the only thing that might give her daughter a future. She met Daniel's eyes and knew. Whatever came next, there was no turning back now. The lift shook as it rose, the old cables groaning with every movement. Kayla held Leary close, feeling the girl's warm breath against her neck. Daniel stood beside them, his eyes fixed on the narrow gap in the lift's metal door. He was watching the shadows below, making sure no one had followed them. When the lift stopped, they stepped into a dim storage level above the main freight station. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. Stacks of metal crates lined the walls, creating narrow paths between them. Daniel moved quickly, guiding Kayla through the maze. "We can't stay here long," he whispered. "If they track us this far, we'll be trapped." Kayla's arms were heavy from carrying Leary, but she didn't complain. Her bare feet were numb from the cold floor, yet she forced herself to keep up. Every sound echoed in the storage room, the faint hum of machinery, the creak of metal under their weight. They reached a narrow service door at the far end. Daniel pressed his ear against it, listening. Then he opened it a crack, peering outside. A walkway stretched across the upper side of the station, giving a clear view of the loading platforms below. Workers moved about, loading cargo onto large transports, while security guards patrolled the area. Daniel pointed toward the far end of the platform. "See that transport? The green one. It's headed out of the city in less than an hour. If we get on it, we can reach the outer zones without being scanned." Kayla followed his gaze, spotting the large green cargo transport. It looked big enough to carry dozens of crates, maybe even hide 2 people and a child inside. "And if they search it?" she asked quietly. "Then we run again," he said simply. They stepped out onto the walkway, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. Halfway across, Kayla froze. Down below, near the station entrance, a group of bounty hunters had gathered. She recognized 2 of them from the market, the ones Daniel had fought. They were speaking to a security officer, showing him something on a small device. Daniel saw them too. "They're spreading your description. We have to move faster." They hurried along the walkway, but as they neared the stairs leading to the platform, the sound of boots on metal echoed behind them. Daniel glanced back to see two security guards heading their way. "Go," he whispered to Kayla. "I'll slow them down." Kayla hesitated, fear rising in her chest. "I'm not leaving you." "Do you want Leary safe or not?" His voice was sharp but low. She didn't answer. She just gripped her daughter tighter and hurried down the stairs, her heart pounding. Daniel stayed at the top, his broad frame blocking the guard's path. She didn't look back. The platform was busier up close. Cargo drones hummed as they carried crates, and the shouts of workers mixed with the hiss of steam from the loading machinery. Kayla wove through the crowd, keeping her head low. Leary clung to her, half asleep but sensing the tension in her mother's steps. She reached the green transport and scanned the side for a way in. There, a maintenance hatch slightly ajar. She crouched and pulled it open, revealing a narrow space between stacked containers. It was dark, but there was enough room for them to hide. She slid inside, settling Leary against her lap. Her hands shook as she pulled the hatch closed again, leaving only a thin crack of light. Her ears strained for any sound of Daniel. Minutes dragged by. Then faintly, she heard footsteps approaching. The hatch opened, and Daniel slipped inside, closing it quickly behind him. His cheek was scraped, and there was a fresh cut on his arm, but he was breathing steadily. "They're on alert," he murmured. "We have to stay silent until we're moving." Kayla nodded. She could hear voices outside, workers calling orders, guards asking questions. Once, a shadow passed directly in front of the hatch, and she held her breath, afraid the person would look inside. But the shadow moved on. Finally, the sound of engines starting filled the air. The transport shuddered, then began to move. Kayla felt the vibration through the metal walls, each turn and bump making her grip Leary tighter. For a few moments, there was silence between them, just the hum of the engines. Then Daniel spoke quietly. "When we reach the outer zones, there's someone I can contact. A friend. He's not part of the rebellion, but he doesn't trust the Empire either. He might help us get the chip to the right hands." Kayla stared at him through the dim light. "Why are you doing this? You could have left me in the alley. You could have walked away." Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the small gap in the hatch. "Because I've seen too many people crushed between two sides of a war they didn't choose. You're not a soldier. Neither is she. You shouldn't have to run forever." She wanted to believe him, but trust was something she had learned to give only once, and she had already lost the man she gave it to. Still, Daniel's voice held a steady certainty that made her want to hope, even if it was dangerous. Hours passed. The steady rhythm of the transport was almost enough to lull her into sleep, but she forced herself to stay awake. At one point, the transport slowed, and she heard muffled voices outside, guards talking about a checkpoint. Daniel's hand moved to his weapon, his body tense. The voices grew louder, then faded again as the engines roared back to full power. They had passed without being searched. Kayla let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing for the first time in days. When the transport finally stopped, Daniel peeked through the hatch. The station outside was smaller, with fewer guards and dimmer lights. "This is our stop," he said. They slipped out quietly, blending into the shadows between the cargo crates. The air was colder here, the streets quieter. In the distance, Kayla could see the faint glow of the outer zones, a place she had never dared to go before. Daniel led the way through the dark streets, his pace steady but cautious. Kayla followed, clutching Leary, feeling the weight of the chip in her pocket. Every step brought them farther from the city, but closer to the unknown. Somewhere deep inside, she knew the danger wasn't over. But for now, they had made it one step further than she thought they could. And that, for the moment, was enough to keep her moving. The cold night air bit into Kayla's skin as they moved through the quiet streets of the outer zone. Leary's head rested on her shoulder, the child half asleep but clinging tightly to her mother's neck. Daniel walked ahead, scanning every alley and rooftop with sharp eyes. His hand stayed close to his weapon, ready for trouble. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Daniel stopped at the edge of a narrow street. He looked both ways, then motioned for Kayla to follow. "Almost there," he said in a low voice. "My friend lives near the old freight yard. No one comes there unless they have a reason." The freight yard was silent. the tall metal fences casting long shadows under the moonlight. They reached a small, worn-down building at the far end. Daniel knocked twice on the door, then once more after a pause. A moment later, the door creaked open, and a broad-shouldered alien with gray skin and dark eyes appeared. "Daniel," the alien said, his deep voice calm but wary. "You're late." "Had company," Daniel replied. He stepped aside so the alien could see Kayla and Leary. "They need a place to stay, and I need to get something to the right people." The alien's gaze lingered on Kayla, then on the bundle in her arms. "Inside," he said simply. The room was small but warmer than the streets. A single lamp lit the space, casting a golden glow on the walls. Kayla sat down with Leary on a low bench, her body aching from the long walk. Daniel and the alien spoke quietly in the corner, their voices too low for her to catch every word. But she heard enough. Mentions of the chip, bounty hunters, and danger if it's traced. The alien eventually came over and crouched in front of her. "Daniel says you have something important, something that can't fall into the wrong hands." Kayla hesitated, her fingers tightening around the chip in her pocket. She looked at Daniel. He gave a small nod, his expression steady. Slowly, she pulled the small metal piece out and held it up. The alien's eyes narrowed, recognizing it immediately. "This is worth 1,000 lives," he said quietly. "And it's worth 1,000 deaths if the wrong side gets it." Before Kayla could respond, a sharp noise echoed from outside, a metallic clang followed by muffled voices. Daniel was at the window in an instant, his posture tense. "They found us," he said. The alien cursed under his breath and moved to a panel on the wall, pressing a hidden switch. A section of the floor slid open, revealing a narrow passage below. "Go," he ordered. "I'll hold them off." Kayla's heart pounded. "What about you?" "I can take care of myself," the alien said. "But if they get that chip, none of us will survive what comes next." Daniel grabbed her arm and guided her toward the opening. She climbed down carefully, holding Leary close. The air below was damp and smelled of earth. Daniel followed, closing the hatch above them. They were in a tight underground tunnel, lit only by faint strips of light along the walls. "Where does this lead?" Kayla asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Out of the yard," Daniel replied. "There's an old drainage outlet that opens into the woods. If we can reach it, we can disappear." They moved quickly, the sound of distant footsteps echoing above. Somewhere behind them, faint blasts shook the ground. The alien was fighting to keep the hunters occupied. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder. Leary stirred in Kayla's arms, waking slightly. "Mama? Where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Kayla whispered, though she wasn't sure it was true. After several minutes, a faint light appeared ahead. Daniel quickened his pace, reaching the exit first. He peered outside, then motioned for her to follow. The outlet opened into a wide stretch of dark forest, the trees swaying in the night wind. "Go straight," he said. "Stay low. We need distance before dawn." They stepped into the forest, the cold wind cutting through their thin clothing. The ground was uneven, roots and fallen branches catching at their feet. But Kayla kept moving, driven by the need to get Leary as far from danger as possible. They had made it only a few hundred meters when a sharp crack rang out, a gunshot. Bark splintered from a tree beside them. Daniel pushed Kayla to the ground, covering her and Leary with his body. "They're here," he said through clenched teeth. More shots followed, the sound bouncing through the trees. Daniel fired back, his shots quick and controlled. Kayla kept her head down, holding Leary close and whispering for her to stay still. The fight was short but brutal. Daniel managed to drop two of the hunters, but another charged from the side, knocking him to the ground. Kayla's instincts took over. She grabbed a fallen branch and swung it as hard as she could, striking the attacker in the head. The alien staggered, and Daniel finished him with a single shot. Breathing hard, Daniel helped her up. "You all right?" She nodded, though her legs felt weak. "We have to keep moving." They pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of pursuit fading slowly behind them. By the time the first light of dawn touched the trees, they had reached a narrow ravine with a shallow stream running through it. Daniel stopped there, kneeling to wash blood from his arm. Kayla sat on a rock, Leary leaning against her. For the first time since the market, there was no immediate sound of danger. She reached into her pocket, feeling the chip's cold surface. "What happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked at her, his face tired but determined. Now we find the people who can use this without getting you killed. And until then, I stay with you. Kayla studied him for a moment, the morning light catching in his eyes. He wasn't her husband. He wasn't family. But in the days since they'd met, he had fought for her and Leary as if they were his own. Leary stirred and looked up at Daniel. "Will you stay with us forever?" she asked in a sleepy voice. Daniel gave a faint smile. "For as long as you need me." Kayla didn't say anything, but a small part of the fear inside her eased. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for now, they had survived the night. And as long as Daniel kept his word, they still had a chance to see another one.